Hello there. Now, for any leader, there can be no greater challenge than being asked to come to the aid of your country when it's in critical danger. I'm delighted to welcome Dick Elsy, former CEO of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, HVM Catapult as we sometimes call it. And he was asked to do just that when the pandemic struck and there was a dire need to get equipment to hospitals that we just didn't have. Dick, a very warm welcome. Tell us what happened when the phone went. What did you hear? What was the question being asked of you?
Well, this was in March 2020 when the our news screens were full of images of Italian hospitals turning people away because they didn't have enough intensive care beds or intensive care ventilators. And UK government, I think it's well documented, was ill prepared. And we only had about 6,000 ventilators and reckoned that we needed about 30,000. So Cabinet Office with Michael Gove put out a sort of emergency call to industry to see if it could repurpose itself to make intensive care ventilators, bearing in mind that there aren't any intensive care ventilators manufactured in the UK. And of course, every nation wanted one and you couldn't buy them for love nor money. So we were genuinely stuck, and hence the request to industry in general to repurpose to make some. And I was chief executive of the High Manufacturing Catapult at the time, and the day job was bringing companies together of different sorts to collaborate on complicated projects. So in a moment's weakness, I volunteered to pull some people together to have a go at it. And we weren't short of volunteers, which was mightily encouraging. But I used my little black book and selected a few people who I knew and could trust to come together to see what we could do.
Tell us some of the key partners and how they jumped in to help, and what mechanisms you had to deploy in order to facilitate communication as you progressed the design and manufacture of these devices.
Okay, well, the selection of the initial consortium members, the real core, was very much people who I knew would be prepared to join me. And there were lots of volunteers, but were there sufficient people who were prepared to take a personal and corporate risk in this endeavour? And basically, I needed the use of lots of heavy muscle resource, and I needed people to be able to commit to that without having to have committee meetings and all that sort of thing, because we just didn't have time to do that. So my shortlist was McLaren, Airbus, Ford, Siemens to kick off initially. And we got together and said, what do we think we can do? And we were all experienced, the senior people that came together, all experienced program management types who'd either run Formula One complex programs, done aircraft, cars. And what we found is, although disparate industries, we all spoke a common language, that of engineering, and we might use different three-letter acronyms for stuff, but the fundamentals of program management principles were all there. So we basically very quickly agreed a set of ground rules around how we're going to manage and how we're going to communicate, mostly on Zoom. And we set up, not long after setting up Zoom, we set up a Teams platform where we had one version of the truth, a common data set. So that was the initial selection criteria. And we set up a program management office in order to anticipate developing a bill of material, a production plan, facilitization of factories. So that was just a kind of natural thing to do. And we drew in some really good program management resource, which was used by Ford, a company called Quick Release, who I have to say were just outstanding. And they were used to setting up program offices and were just on it like a rash. And before we knew it, we had this whole office set up and all the necessary mechanisms to start populating a project. But the fantastic thing was, despite us being different industries, we had such a compelling common ground. We spoke the same language and drove the same processes, even though they were on different time frames. Aircraft taking a little bit longer than a Formula One car.
I think history relates that it was an extraordinary venture, brilliantly conceived and executed. I think the figure was 17,000 ventilators you created.
We got behind two ventilators, one a paramedic device made by Smiths Industries, which was good for the initial ambulance stuff. We made a couple of thousand of those by helping Smiths with the support of Rolls-Royce and GKN. But the complicated one was the intensive care ventilator. And we developed quite a lot of credibility with the Cabinet Office early on as a credible consortium, because lots of people were having a go. Dyson, for instance, threw his hat into the ring, a load of others. But because we had access to a lot of serious resource and muscle and had got ourselves very quickly organised, we were seen as a very credible player. And we were introduced to a tiny little business called Penlon excuse me, in Abingdon. And Penlon make niche anesthesia equipment. So they make a couple of units a day of anesthesia kit. And they'd managed to configure some of their systems, cobbled them together with some duct tape and tubes and stuff, and managed to develop this intensive care ventilate credible specification. And the clinicians and the regulator said, if you can make that, that's what we want. So we visited Penlon, got introduced to the CEO late one night. This is probably on the Thursday of the first week. And we had a hit squad in with him the following morning. We got permission to travel. And engineers took a look at this, ran through a likely bill of material, and we made a decision on the spot that afternoon whether we would commit to make this thing or not. Bearing in mind the supply chains for this thing was set up for 2 a day, and we needed 400 a day. So it was a completely different league. But on the basis that if what we couldn't source through regular channels, we said we'd find a way of getting it, and if we couldn't physically get it, we'd make it. So there was a pretty clear hierarchy, you know. Yep. And the beauty was, of course, we had an awful lot of manufacturing muscle in terms of being able to make stuff, and particularly precision components. We had all the Formula One teams, which were, we call it front office or back officed by McLaren. So they acted as a portal to all the British Formula One teams. And bear in mind, they were all on, furlough or not doing anything. The workshops were shut. So we had access to a lot of top quality engineering resource and a lot of machining capability. Typical small bits precision. All the CNC machinery was just at our disposal. So we very quickly went through a bill of material. What can we buy, even though the channels were compromised, and what can we make? But we hit some real, to describe it, show-stopping roadblocks in that process, which honestly, even with the most optimistic outlook, we thought it would kill us. Just one example, there's a complicated circuit board and a screen on this device. And in order to maintain regulatory approval, we couldn't change the chipsets or anything like that. Otherwise, we'd have to go through a major regulatory approval process. One of the chips, an AMD processor, had gone out of production then 12 years ago. So entrepreneurial, who else uses it? Is it in a washing machine, a TV, DVD player? Let's go robbing parts. No, it's a medical device and obsolete. So we thought that was a killer, but the McLaren team, unstoppable, managed to persuade AMD to give them the chip mask, and they booked a fab facility, bearing in mind everything was in lockdown, in Israel, and for $6.8 million up front, which the Cabinet Office came up with in 24 hours. And they made the chip from scratch. Unbelievable, unbelievable.
Well, I think I'm right. That 17,000 figure I came up with, is that roughly right, the number of these that you made?
Yes, so we did 11,680 intensive care ones and a couple of thousand of the Smiths Parapack. And in the first month, there was just an example of the sourcing. We sourced 11 million parts in the first month with the help of DHL, we chose a logistics partner. And that was a mixture of stuff that we knew we could get. So we were asking people to come in and set their factories up and make stuff, or we made it ourselves. And interestingly, we were never held up for parts at any point, which is incredible, really. We thought parts would be the defining factor, but it was getting a stable production process ultimately that was the rate setting challenge.
Running a just-in-time supply chain in a situation like that must have been, well, brilliant. Everybody came together. Dick, I want to talk to you about what you were going through. I mean, you had thrown your hat into the ring for better or worse, and here you were having to hold this ring together. What was going through your mind? What did you have to draw on in yourself to see this through and to pull everybody together, albeit that everybody was being incredibly cooperative and collaborative anyway?
Well, to be honest, I volunteered because we were in a national emergency, and it felt very easy to volunteer at the time, given the position I was in. Having said that, putting the phone down and making the commitment to Michael Gove in front of a load of industrialists, there was a big gulp when I put the phone down. And yeah, it suddenly felt as if the whole world's eyes had swiveled round to look at Dick Elsy. So it felt pretty scary to start with. But that's when right, okay, I can't do this on my own. I need some serious muscle and people I can trust. So I started phoning around and didn't have any trouble actually with the principal players of getting them on side.
But again, I'm keen to know about yourself. This is about leadership. It's about the qualities you had to draw on within yourself to keep, when the going was tough, the tough just have no choice but to get going. And what did you draw on in yourself to make that happen?
Well, I mean, I might not have been the greatest engineer in my time, but the things I was good at was leading programs and leading people. So I drew on those resources about giving people the compelling purpose, which is pretty self-evident, keeping them motivated to say there's a route through all of this, even though, as I could describe to you, like the chipset, I honestly thought we were bust at that point. But the team didn't want to give up because we were pushing so hard. Interestingly, there was a lot of very senior people involved in that process, top leaders, and no surprise that many of us lost our way occasionally. It all became a bit too much. So a big part of my job was being there for them and being a coach. Often, even just a 10-minute conversation was enough to fix things. And, we were doing this late into the night. I mean, we were working till way past midnight, most nights taking calls, organising stuff, and then we're all up at 4 o'clock in the morning back on again. So it was pretty grueling. But the leadership bits, bringing people along with you and giving them the vision and the purpose, and creating the no ego, shared endeavour culture. In fact, it was right at the outset. My first words were rule one, no egos. I'm not having any egos around the table. So there was a careful selection in that process. Of course, I chose people who I knew were low ego types. And that was an absolute fundamental critical success factor, that there was never any egos displayed. There was never any blame. So if something went wrong, and we had to empower people to do some extraordinary things, and I like the chipset I just described, and sometimes those things would go wrong. And it wasn't because of lack of effort. It just, shit happens, especially in that sort of environment when you're taking huge risks. And whenever there was a problem like that, it instantly became a team problem. So it was a shared issue. So creating that environment where nobody was pointing the finger, we were on it like a rash. If there was a constraint or a problem, it was a shared thing. So a key part of my job was to create that environment and make sure we had the resources and pulled the right sort of people in.
Did you surprise yourself at the way you got everybody through this, including yourself?
Yes, because I think it was, in terms of sort of career, it was like a car program on steroids compressed into just a very few weeks. And the initial stages, we were just, I think, carried on adrenaline, to be honest. I did surprise myself. I didn't think I had quite so much resolve and reserve. I think, in fact, I would say that was the same for all of the leadership, actually. We really surprised ourselves what was possible when you dig deep.
This is going to be an awfully difficult question to answer. Looking back, were these talents, skills, qualities that you brought to this project, had you learned them or were they innate?
Well, on the basis that we're all in it together, these weren't a unique skill set. These skill sets have been, all of us, acquired through our careers. And interestingly, again, I chose people in leadership positions, so pre-qualified, they were natural leaders. Now, do you acquire leadership skills, or are they kind of like wired into you? I think there's a bit of both, to be honest. I think there are some people who are natural leaders and then benefit from good mentoring, good exposure. I wouldn't say courses, but I can't remember many leadership courses making a difference to me. But some people are born that way and wired that way, and I happened to choose people who I knew were like that. I know it's quite a bit of a mistake to hire people in your own image, but this was a job that needed doing. So I had to have people who I knew we thought alike. So I think those skills are wired into people, and then probably realized through experience, people grabbing experience. Take a look at the people around the table. We'd all be natural leaders, but had grabbed any opportunity through our careers to lead something and get stuck in and make a difference. So very similar minded people, wired the same way.
We're having this conversation, Dick, because as part of the wider programme, we're looking at the qualities manufacturers in the UK are having to adopt in an age which really began the very week you started the Ventilator Challenge. That's when everything hit the fan, the pandemic, and then supply chains worldwide, geopolitical uncertainty, warfare. We're having to do things differently these days. We can't take for granted those low interest rates, that sort of relative peace, being able to order something 8,000 miles away and know it's going to be delivered next Tuesday at 4 p.m.
Yep.
That's just not happening. Manufacturers are having to rise to this challenge. And I'm wondering what you would say if you were standing in front of a bunch of SME manufacturers in particular who are saying, you know what, I'm having to do things I never had to do before. I'm having to hedge my electricity bill. I'm having to find alternate suppliers. What would you say to them?
Well, I think taking the lesson out of ventilators, anything's possible. So even if your established supply chains are challenging, is take a risk and go and do something else. And we basically reshored a whole load of stuff because we had no choice. So accepting that is a constraint, then hit the constraint head on and find another way around it. And all too often people rely on established stuff and don't want to change. But in fact, affecting the change and doing something different and taking a bit of a risk debottlenecks things. And I would say that was a key characteristic, which I think is one of the key learning points, is an uncompromising approach to constraints. So anything that was stopping us is find a different way around it. Just fix it. And it does take a bit of resource to do it, but you can do some extraordinary things if you adopt that philosophy. Is nothing's a problem. We just need to fix it. And that would be my coaching when things seemingly seem impossible, is just go at it. relentlessly, and you will find solutions if you keep at it. You'll find solutions.
I suspect that you're right. I think that pressure inevitably pulls out different qualities that we just didn't know were there. There's one question that some people have posed, or a point people have made, which is that manufacturers in the UK have had such a distinguished industrial history, getting on for 200 years now, and that somehow the way we've always done things is the way we'll always do them. And that is a philosophy that's just never going to work. But it's more ingrained in us because culturally that's how we've done things. And I'm wondering if that doesn't need to break a little as well under some of this pressure.
No, I agree. And if I take a look at the UK, I think it's a lack of willingness to take risks, actually. I think, generally speaking, Brits in manufacturing are quite conservative, and it's been conservative for a long time, and it feels safe not to take risks. I'm doing that with some of my other work now as a non-exec director, is actually giving people more permission to take risks when they haven't been, because it slows things down so much. Indecision, it's not willful indecision, it's just acceptance of constraints. We can't go anywhere else because that's been our supplier for such a long time, or we can't risk the quality by going somewhere else. We can't. There's too many reasons not to do things, and I think it is exaggerated somewhat in the UK, and it's a fear about taking risk, and that the biggest lesson of all out of the ventilator thing is you got to take risks, because if you don't take risks, you can't deliver. So we took a lot of risks. But the interesting analysis is, because you would say, well, of course, if you're taking risks, you end up falling flat on your face, or you end up spending a shed load of extra money because you're taking risks and you might not pay off. The opposite was true. In fact, by taking risks, we did ultimately deliver. And by taking risks and doing things quickly, we spent less than we expected. So these ventilators were delivered for about 10 grand a time. Bearing in mind they were made from scratch, from an incredible array of supply chain, including self-made chipsets, for 10 grand. And a standard intensive care ventilator is about 19 grand. So it wasn't as if we hosed money at it, but we just pushed hard. And I think there's a perception that by taking risks, you expose timing risk, you expose financial risk. Actually, the opposite was true, because you get focused on delivery and constraint removal, everything else falls into place.
So I imagine that if you were talking to the manager or managing director of a manufacturing company at the moment, feeling a bit flummoxed by all the change and the pressure that's on them, what would you say about internal politics, about the way they manage teams themselves, about perhaps liberating some of their teams from perhaps previously rigid structures?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, in fact, a lot of what I do as a non-exec now is about doing that, is this permission to take a risk and empowering people to get on with it. Because, again, it is a little bit of a UK problem, a sense of hierarchy in a business, and things do get quite congested in terms of decision making. And it's incredible what you can release if you allow people much further down your organization to have accountability and the resources and tools to deliver, in which case give people financial authority at levels that you'd normally feel uncomfortable about. Financial approval levels are there for good reason in good corporate governance. But, when you step back and analyze it, that's one of the things I encourage people to look at. Because if you've got those levels set too low, everything ends up on the chief executive's desk. And really, they're not fully empowered to sort it all out. So the inbox fills up. You're much better off making sure you've got suitably qualified people further down your organization and let them get on with the job. And it becomes self-fulfilling, energizing. For people further down the organization, often younger people, feel energized. They enjoy their work more. They've got more responsibility. You're sharing the burden of risk and responsibility. So if you give people responsibility. They'll wake up in the middle of the night thinking, oh, I better be on the ball with that tomorrow. So it's not just the CEOs that lie awake at night. You've got some other people in the organisation fretting about things too, which is a good thing. But it is all about letting go. And one of my other jobs is in the public sector, which of course is renowned for its difficulty in authority levels. But we've worked really hard to get higher authority levels to enable people to get on with the job, and it's possible to achieve.
Dick, final thought. All the pandemonium that has gone on, from the pandemic through to all the other things I mentioned, together with the possibility of a change of government and a change of attitude to manufacturing, it feels like all the various bits are coming together for something of a renaissance of UK manufacturing, people becoming more aware of what we do. Do you feel optimistic about that? And do you feel hopeful that we have got the qualities that you think we need in manufacturing to capitalise on this, to really give manufacturing a new place in the sun, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm super optimistic about that. And that's not just blind optimism. There's lots of evidence that government, whether it's Conservatives or we're going to end up with a Labour government, they're all tuned into the importance of manufacturing value add in the UK and the words sovereign capability. I think one of the most powerful messages from the COVID crisis and lockdown was the realization that the UK had become so dependent on overseas supply chains. And the price you pay for that versus the apparent cost benefit. We can get this component, X pounds cheaper. But when your whole business falls over, suddenly those decisions, and that was felt quite viscerally at corporate level in businesses, but very much so at government level. So I found, because I still do some work in that space, I've found that conversations with ministers and government officials about building and maintaining sovereign capability in the UK it's been the best I've ever known it. And you've seen examples of quite appropriate government investment in things like battery technology, following the same trends as our competitors do in Europe and the States, where governments are backing businesses with support packages and enablement. We're asking for no more than that. And I have to say, government is delivering, and it's getting behind nuclear power in a big way. It's grabbed a hold of some important national assets, things like Sheffield Forge Masters. There's a whole load of fresh money going in there. I was there a week or so ago. Fantastic, big investment programs in maintaining proper UK capability. And that's not about bailing things out. It's about making sure we've got the right investments in the UK. So I'm super optimistic about that. Super optimistic.
Well, Dick Elsy, it has been a total pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure, Nick.
Dick Elsy there. Thank you very much indeed for watching. This has been a Manufacturing TV presentation. I'm Nick Peters. Goodbye for now.